All right, going to be digging into a couple of concepts here, some that have been coming up in my recent conversations centered around the ideas in the fourth political theory. These specific Heideggerian concepts that I wanted to dig into here are the idea of Throwness, right? Throwness is how Dasein, how the human finds himself in the world. And it's inextricably linked with place, history, and the sense of the past, the present, and the future. And he says essentially that you need all three of these ecstasies of time, as Heidegger calls them, in order to build a civilization, build a people, have a future. And that human beings have to have a projection. They project into the future their being, and in doing so, realize their being in the world, in a sense. So he's going to critique the West of kind of closing off the futures for multiple civilizations. And he's going to critique the West and this kind of monotonic, hyper-progressive vision that he says ultimately would lead to the West as the automaton, right? And that it's going to be a closure of all possible futures. And at the end of this section, he talks about and introduces radical subjectivity as this way to reorient and reorient Dasein into his world and to build potential and possible futures. So he's talking about here, he says, therefore, members of a society should ask themselves today about their future. If they have a history, they could have a future. If they have both a history and a future, they are. If they are, the future is implicit. Now in the present, the future is being made now. And it's interesting to juxtapose this idea with the reality of cultural revolutions that we see have part of their inaugural goal is to erase the past of a particular culture, tear down statues, old laws, old ways of being and knowing are erased. They're not just changed or forgotten, they're erased and deleted from the past. And what he would argue, this cutting off the past also cuts off the future. And he says that this is the progression that we're seeing ourselves in, being closed off from both the past and the future, and then eventually the present, and that will lead to the technological singularity, which is a very kind of dark path that he's warning here. And he critiques the West as a racist, for its racist roots, not from the left. He gives a critique, I would say from the right, but it's not even from the right. But he gives this critique in the context of this technological and framing of progress of the science being completely entrenched into the social world. That's ultimately leading to the hollowing out of Dasein, in a sense. But let's start reading here again. He says, on the basis, we can establish both prognosis and projection of being in the world and making a future. He says, according to Heidegger, Throwness is a concept that describes the interactions of the subject with its surroundings in everyday life. This reminded me of the agent arena concept that John Vervaeke puts forth. All right, he says, Throwness is a concept that describes the interactions of the subject with its surroundings in everyday life that cause it to act upon instincts, form immediate reactions to other people's language and actions, flow with the situation, and make immediate interpretations. Being thrown into a situation without being able to reflect on it first, and therefore not acting, is also an action for reflection on the situation, i.e. not acting is also something that can be interpreted as an action. It says, one therefore must rely on instinctual interpretations and go with the flow. The thrownness of the subject, Dasein, forces it to project itself into the future. Later on, he says, the analysis of the future is rooted in this. By apprehending the future, we are making it. Therefore, any consideration of the future is to work on history and the consciousness of time as such. Therefore, any consideration of the future, since we create the future by considering it, is to work on history and the consciousness of time as such. And now he's going to bring in this critique of the West, saying that unless we have, he's critiquing essentially, or he's playing off of the death of God here. He says, unless we have some meta society, some metaphysical structure to be rooted in, right, there can't be kind of a universal subject. He says, it is doubtful that one society is capable of comprehending another society at the same level as it is comprehended by its own members. Such a possibility presupposes the existence of the meta-society, the society God, which could operate with the ultimate depths of consciousness in the same manner as consciousness operates with awareness, noesis, intentionality, logic, time, and finally with the world. So this kind of made me think that, that we have to be plugged into our inner life and our outer world. And then in the broader context, just like we're intimately familiar with at least our conscious feelings and emotions, we are not, that doesn't fractally scale up of being kind of inculcated in a collective consciousness that is thriving. So it's impossible, he's saying here, for some universal subject to emerge because we don't have this connection with this meta-society. He says, obviously, Western society is particularly afflicted with such an ethnocentric approach and, quote, universal pretensions rooted in its racist and colonialist past. But in the 20th century, this was proven to be completely unfounded and false. Structuralists, sociologists, cultural anthropologists, postmodernists, phenomenologists, linguists, existentialists, and so on have developed convincing arguments demonstrating that the inner nature of such an attitude is rooted in the will to power, Nietzsche, and paranoid imposition of one's own identity on the other, capital O. So he's bringing in the psychoanalytic critique as well. He says, this illness is called Western racism. All right, I'll read that last part again here. So sociologists, structuralists, and anthropologists have all deployed convincing arguments demonstrating that the inner nature of such an attitude, right, is rooted in the will to power and paranoid impositions of one's own identity on the other. This illness is called Western racism. It says the West is a local and historical phenomenon. It is a very acute civilization, very particular, very arrogant, and very smart. But it is just one civilization among many others. The West has history and is because of its history. The attempt to abdicate this history in favor of pure universalism and in favor of metaculture and a metalanguage is doomed. There are two possible outcomes for this, for the West. He says, one, either the West will lose its own identity and will turn into an automaton, or two, or will try to impose its own history, conceived by itself as being universal, on all other existing civilizations, destroying them in the process, and creating a new kind of global concentration camp for their cultures. So that's something to think about. I'd like to know what you think about that juxtaposition of the possible futures of the West, at least given the track that we're on now. Either the West will lose its own identity and turn into an automaton, or in this globalization effort to impose its own history, conceived by itself as being universal on all other existing civilizations, destroying them in the process and creating a new kind of global concentration camp for their cultures. Continues here. The first outcome, the outcome of the automaton, implies a struggle of automatons with humanity. The second implies an inevitable global liberation movement struggling against the neo-imperialism. It is for the West to decide how to manage the consequences of its proper history and its implications. The West can try to close its history, but it is unlikely that it will succeed in closing the history of all others. Now is the moment to begin the fight for the historical being of societies. This historical being is time, the sense of which is constituted subjectively. This sense can reside only in a given society itself. Time is socially and subjectively constructed. The West cannot intersect with the sense of non-Western societies. The non-Western societies, i.e. the rest, cannot correctly understand the West and its values. So he's really getting into the details of his critique of this universalism of the West. Again, I'd love to know what you think here. It says, they are in continuous error thinking that they can. The non-Western societies, it says, it is false, they cannot. But likewise, Western people cannot understand the rest. The structures of the subjects, its sense of time, and its music are all different. The past, the present, and the future of historical societies cannot be exposed by a metaculture. They are lying too deep and are defended from foreign eyes by the destructive might of the self-referential moment, by the shock of this great tension. What for the West is, for the other cultures, is not. So we are dealing with different conceptions of time and with different futures. At last, we have come to the quote-unquote end of history and globalization. The end of history is the logical conclusion of universalism. The end of history is the abolition of the future. History proceeds and reaches its terminal state. There's no more space to go on. By abolishing the future, the entire structure of time, such as the past and the present, are also abolished. How can this be possible? We could compare it to the simultaneous playing of all existing notes, sounds, and melodies of a musical piece, resulting in a cacophony, the gnashing and grinding of teeth. At the same time, it will provoke absolute silence, deafness, and sourness. Hence, there will be no space for the temporalization of the... I just lost my spot here. Hence, there will be no space for the temporalization of the inner tension of transcendental subjectivity. The short circuit would grow exponentially without the possibility of being dissipated. That means the igniting of a conflagration, the same fire that usually goes hand in hand with the sword. In order to prevent the blaze, and this is, I underline this section here, in order to prevent the blaze and the clashing of swords that would result from closing the temporal and logical relief valve, the world will strive to trap consciousness in networks and virtuality, where it can run away from the inner pressure of self-awareness without issue. I found that just very thought-provoking. I'm going to read it again. In order to prevent the blaze and the clashing of swords that would result from the closing the temporal and logical relief valve, the world will strive to trap consciousness in networks and virtuality, where it can run away from the inner pressure of self-awareness without issue. To me, that's seeing that this existential sense of alienation will be exacerbated and taken to its limit in this case. If it succeeds, he says, the new world of the machine kingdom will be created. The global networks of cyberspace are suitable only for the existence of post-humans, a post-society, and post-culture. Instead of fire, we will be getting lightning and electricity. Some people believe Fukuyama is already a robot. Francis Fukuyama is a postmodern thinker. He wrote a book entitled The End of History. He says some people believe Fukuyama is already a robot. So he's intuiting this idea that we are already kind of merging with the algorithms. And this is, he was writing in 2011. We're already kind of merging in a spiritual sense with the algorithms and the technology that we use and operate. It starts kind of using us. That's kind of what I reflected there. He says, continuing, globalization is equivalent to the end of history. Both go hand in hand. They are semantically linked. Different societies have different histories. That means different futures. If we're going to make a tomorrow common to all societies existing on the planet, if we are going to purpose a global future, then we need first to destroy the history of those other societies, to delete their pasts, to annihilate the continuous moment of the present, virtualizing the realities that are constructed by the content of historical time. So he's critiquing this position. He's saying in order for globalization to win out, it's got to extinguish the histories of individual peoples and civilizations. What do you think about that? All right, continuing, he says, a common future, a quote-unquote common future, means the deletion of particular histories, but this means that no histories at all, including their futures, will exist. The common future is no future. Globalization is the death of time. Globalization cancels out the transcendental subjectivity of Husserl or the Dasein of Heidegger. There would be neither any more time nor being. We must deal with the bifurcation of temporal constructions. It is time to address this question with all its implicit weight. Now, on the eve of the end of history, Dugan says, the edge of the descent into post-history, we could make the decision to give different ontological responses. So he's saying here is a potential alternative response to the seemingly inevitable trajectory that he sees the West bringing the world towards. So when we construct the future, it should not be global in scope. It cannot be just one future. We must have many futures. The transcendental subjectivities, cultures, and societies can preserve space for the scattering of energies born of the encounter with oneself, the short circuit in question through its temporalization, that will grant the existence of the outer world and the continuing of always and necessarily local histories. Time will continue, and the world as the experience of real presencing will be supported by the structure of the deep subjectivity. So he's giving his affirmative alternative here, and he's using a lot of Heidegger, where he says history will remain local. Yes, time will continue in the world as the experience of real presencing. Heidegger talks about this, how we presence the world, right? Dasein is filled and it presents the world in its thrownness. It discloses the world. Will be supported by the structure of deep subjectivity. So it's about integrating the agent in the arena, is the way that kind of stood out to me there, right? If we are intimately and inextricably linked with our environment, with other people, and with ourselves, right? That is his alternative, at least what I think he's saying here. He says the common history must be a symphony of the different music of local histories being created by the unique chronological rhythms of times, and not one part attempting to drown out and overwhelm the rest until it is only sound, and until it is the only sound that can be heard. So I like this idea, and this came up in my discussion with Sherry about this nation states, the people, the tongues, the nations, the peoples, and the tongues, right? The nation states are like organs of a broader body, right? And they're not just organs. Organs are not just placeholders. They also have functions. So I was reflecting on what are there particular functions of each nation state, each civilization that Dugan is identifying here, or that we can identify, that have a functional role with their culture and their history and their unique being in the world to add to this global metastructure, where it can't be this technological virtual empty world that he sees the West trying to distribute across the globe. So this is a potential alternative where you have distinct civilizations playing a particular musical note, and then he talks a lot about earlier in the chapter of harmony and music in terms of time and understanding time. He brings in Husserl there. So I'll read a little bit here. The next question is, does the formalization of the nation state correctly and exhaustively reflect the structure of the transcendental subject as the creator of history? Can we fractally move from the subject, from the individual, to the nation state? Is there fidelity in this fractal movement from one scale to the next? Will future historical time necessarily be national, as constructed by modernity? He's asking these questions. Or will it be expressed in other ways? Maybe it will return to pre-modern forms. When Huntington evokes civilizations, he admits the possibility of emergent localities and local identities being different from the existing manufactured nation states. Civilizations are cultural and religious communities, not ethnic national ones. Civilizations, Dugan says, are cultural and religious communities, not ethnic and national ones. We can imagine a step backward in the pre-national direction, Islamic integration, or a step forward in the post-national direction by, of course, he says, the European Union and the Eurasian Union, or we could tolerate other civilizations in the form of nation states. The historical narratives and the way in which politics formalizes time could be changed. It means that there's a lot of work that should be done, historically speaking. While someone is alive, he can change not only the future, but also the past. The gesture or meaningful action accomplished in the present will add a new sense to the past. Only after death does one's past become the property of another. Hence, the history of peoples, societies, and cultures is open. They have the possibility to make the amazing turn that is necessary to view their past from a new perspective. So history is music and the work of muses, he says. So history is music and the work of muses. Our civilization is destined to clash with each other. It is not written in stone. History lacks linear rules. Difference does not automatically necessitate clash and struggle. Of course, history knows war, but history knows peace as well. War and peace have always existed. War and peace will always be. They serve to relieve the tension and the stress of the present. They liberate and subjugate horror and death. And this is an interesting thought-provoking quote. He says, total war and total peace are equally murderous. Total war and total peace are equally murderous. I found that, again, extremely thought-provoking and reminded me of the idea of the 666 system, right? So total peace, where there are zero traffic accidents, by plan, is tantamount to horror and death. So these two extreme poles of total peace and total war actually kind of manifest the same destruction, Dugan is saying here. And then I underline this spot here. It says, the continuation of the history of local societies instead of a single historical narrative will lead to the preservation of being, and hence to the possibility for the future to happen. The second option is globalization. It cancels the future. It requires the arrival of post-humanity. It constructs the post-world consisting of simulacra and virtual structures. In place of the transcendental subject Dasein, society becomes a huge computer center, a matrix, a supercomputer. Remember, he's writing this over a decade ago. In place of time, it creates simulacrums of the past, present, and the future. I don't know about you, but I've experienced watching and experiencing culture and popular culture. There's nothing new that's being created. They're repackaging old Spider-Man, old Batman, old movies, and they're selling them back to us in a simulated form for an updated generation. But there is no new characters being created like there used to be, at least in my experience. And there's no the types of movies that we see. There's no like hopeful future being presented in the collective consciousness. It's very dystopian. It's very sterile, and it's very technical in terms of what we're being shown. Since the second option is globalization, it cancels the future. It requires the arrival of post-humanity. So it creates simulacras of the past, the present, and future. The simulacrum of the past is false memory, the product of artificial influence rewriting historical memory. So imagine, so maybe AI is already trying to erase the past of humanity, and it's using meme warfare and cultural warfare, and the cultural revolutions, color revolutions are essentially the erasure of the histories of cultures in order to be inculcated into this ever-present consumerism. Just a thought and aside here. All right, he says, the simulacrum of the past is false memory. The walling off of the transcendental subject allows the past to be changed as if it were a pirated DVD. An alternate version of society could be loaded as a prequel. Such a substitution of the past is technically possible. Sufficient control over the present allows the past to be easily rewritten. The substitution of the future follows from this manipulation, Dugan says. Two desperate tracks mixed and played together produce cacophonic repercussions in the future. The future is petrified, and the semantics of time blur, fork, and multiply. Manipulating the present is a little more complicated and requires a higher degree of sophistication. To remove the present, the transcendental subjectivity must not only be walled off, but eradicated. This presumes the transition from the human to the post-human. Developments in the Human Genome Project, cloning, advances in robots, and new generations of cyborgs will bring us close to the advent of post-humanity. The goal of this process is to produce creatures that will lack an existential dimension with zero subjectivity. Simulacrums can be made not only out of reason, but also from unconsciousness. The most important facet of this process is the abolition of the present. Such post-human creatures and inanimate objects, animals, vehicles, plants, stones, and so on, have no sense of the present. If globalization continues, what is the fate of subjectivity? What is the fate of personhood, right? What is the fate of being human? Continuing, he says, what is the ontology of the future that will probably never happen? A fairly unorthodox theory could be suggested. Let us assume that multipolarity is stillborn, that history has ended, and that the project of globalization has become a reality. How will the final exorcism of transcendental subjectivity be performed? How will the final decision concerning the abolition of Dasein be implemented? After all, as long as mankind and society exist, they should make the decision for themselves. It is impossible to make an appeal to the other, capital O, which could be blamed or praised for the decision and its result. Such a reference to the other is acceptable only when the self and the other are one and the same. If we lose our identity, we will also lose alterity. Alterity means other, difference. He says, if we lose our identity, we will lose alterity, the capacity for otherness, and thus the ability to distinguish between self and not self, and consequently to assume the existence of any alternative viewpoint. So we are the authors of the end of history, which concerns ourselves and no one else. Thus, having excluded the presence of the other, an explanation is still required about how man can accomplish the last gesture of self-destruction. How can he transfer the initiatives of existence to the post-human world, a world that will disappear immediately upon the expiration of the last man, for there will be no one left to bear witness? And he's going to introduce briefly his notion of the radical subject. Again, radical, you can think of the term root. Like when you do radicals in mathematics, you're getting to the root. And also, so he's trying, and he talks earlier in his work about trying to find the more originary understanding of Dasein, of being prior to the subject-object divide. So I know that sounds pretty abstract, but he's putting forth this notion of the radical subject here in a bit. So he's talking about how there's not even going to be anyone to witness the end of the world, according to this logic of this trajectory. He says this is a great problem, and it requires an even deeper insight into the structure of the transcendental subject that generates time and its formulations. We need to look deeper into the Husserlian concept of transcendental subject, the Heideggerian concept of Dasein. We need to turn our gaze back towards Dasein and really get an understanding of what is being, not what being does, in a sense. All right, nobody else can make decisions. Nobody else can make decisions about how to reset time or to end it. And an end that can only be brought about by ourselves through a final self-immolation by the exaltation of the short circuit. Hence, the subject carries within itself the possibility of such a chronicide. Globalization and the end of history cannot be reduced to the will of someone other than he who is the source of the creation of time, at least not within the limits of immanent philosophy. Consequently, this can only mean one thing: that within the depths of transcendental subjectivity, there lies another layer which Husserl had not uncovered. Husserl was convinced that the layer he discovered was the last one. And this is earlier in the chapter, he talks about Husserl's discovery of a layer of time that is more primordial than kind of clock time. And he likens it to music, harmony and melody. But it turns out that it is not so. There has to be another dimension yet to be found, the most hidden one. We can designate it as, Dugin says, the radical subject. If Husserl's transcendental subjectivity constitutes reality through the experience of a manifestation of self-awareness, the radical subject is to be found not on the way out, but on the way in. It shows itself only in the moment of ultimate historic catastrophe, in the traumatic experience of the short circuit, which is stronger and lasts for a moment longer than it is possible to endure. The same experience that makes the transcendental subjectivity manifest itself and deploy its content, thus creating time with its intrinsic music, is regarded by the radical subject as an invitation to reveal itself in another manner, on the other side of time. For the radical subject, time, in all its forms and configurations, is nothing more than a trap, a trick, a decoy, delaying the real decision. For the radical subject, it is not only virtuality and the electronic networks which are the prison, but reality itself has already become so. A concentration camp, an agony, and a torture. The slumber of history is something contrary to the condition where the radical subject could exist, complete itself, and become. The creation of subjectivity being the secondary formation of temporality, is an obstacle for its realization. If we accept the hypothesis of the radical subject, we immediately confront an instance that explains who has made the decision in favor of globalization, the suicide of humanity, and the end of history, who has conceived this plan and made it reality. It can therefore only be the drastic gesture of the radical subject looking for liberation from time through the construction of non-temporal, impossible reality. Radical subject is incompatible with all kinds of time. It vehemently demands anti-time based on the exalted fire of eternity transfigured in the radical light. Interesting verbiage there. When everybody has gone, the only thing that remains is those who cannot be gone. Perhaps that is the reason for the greatest of all probations. And that is it. Just the end again of, if you have the book, end of chapter. It's a pretty dense chapter entitled The Ontology of the Future. And again, getting into these concepts such as Dasein, transcendental subject, and Throwness. And I'd like to know what you think of the concept of the radical subject that he introduced at the end there. And I'm not saying that to pass a judgment on the concept, but just to engage with it, play with it a little bit to see if anything kind of comes up. So that is all for now. I appreciate you guys. And until next time, God bless.